Good morning. How are we this morning? Hey, that's it. Kwenzenjani? Nakhona abantu baseThekwini makumele kwabanda kancane nje. Yeah, ne? Good morning everyone. My name is Pamandla Mhlongo, Senior Programs Officer, and I will be facilitating today's program on behalf of the DDP. Thank you very much for joining us today for our, I think it's the 4th annual media summit. It's the 3rd one, okay. I'm getting ahead of myself, like some political parties did for this election. But it's the 3rd annual media summit, and we'd like to welcome you to this engagement. We want to try and reflect quite significantly on the type of coverage that we witnessed from our media partners as it relates to the elections in 2024. A lot of the conversations preceding these specific elections were largely around the party political space as far as the levels of contestation, the degree to which participation from citizens will be sort of wide-ranging. We were hoping that we're going to have large turnout, to the extent that some political parties started to tout this election as being similar to that of 1994. For a number of reasons which can be debated, we need to try and think about how we can compare and contrast that interest as it relates to the pre-1994 period and the one that we now have with the 2024 election. We also witnessed quite significant trends in terms of newer political parties who seem to be have had a lion's share of the media coverage, and we need to ask ourselves perhaps what is the reasoning behind some of those things. Some of the things that we also saw quite significantly was the impact of funding on party political contestation in this election. And so sometimes they say the piper plays the tune, and so it's important to ask whether the media is similarly interlaced with that type of critique. I'm going to ask our Executive Director, Dr. Paul Kariuki, to do an official welcome, and then we'll go ahead and proceed with outlining what the lay of the program looks like for today. And we hope that ultimately, as we might have speakers and panels in the front, that you help us sort of lead the conversation through your participation, through your questions, through your engagement, because ultimately, whilst we exist for the purposes of setting up the platform, ours is just to make sure that we facilitate discussions with those of us in the room. And so we hope that your participation will help us gauge where the media did well, where the media might have erred, and of course, what are the areas of improvement going forward insofar as the media landscape specifically related to covering elections and covering political party campaigns. Dr. Kariuki?
Good morning, colleagues. I trust you all well, and thank you so much again for making time to come and be with us this morning. It's our pleasure as DDP to convene this 3rd annual media summit. Okay, thank you. So as we said, this is our 3rd annual media summit, which we convene with a very powerful and I think intention to ensure that we can create a space for us to reflect on the role of media in deepening democracy in South Africa. But before I got into that conversation here, I would like to acknowledge our speakers who also accepted our invitation to come this morning. Brian is going to introduce them later. But on behalf of the DDP team, the DDP board, and our funders, I want to say thank you for coming through and making time and accepting our invitation amidst your busy schedule. So thank you so much. And we give them a round of applause. This morning. We'll be introduced later this morning. All right, thank you very much. But also adding on to that, as Brian has correctly indicated, we've come through a very competitive election period, and I'm sure you have seen and witnessed the changes that are happening right now in our political landscape, and what it really means for us as citizens and civil society, and what we think should be the role of media going forward in terms of enabling citizen participation in our politics through factual information, through ethical reporting, and of course, constant engagement on different channels that they've created as media houses so that we can continue the conversations that help us understand our political discourse in the country. As DDP, we remain very committed to this process. For the last 30 years since our founding, media has played and continues to play a critical role in DDP's work in helping us to reach audiences that we could not normally reach in a room like this. And we understand the limitations of meeting in a place like here because not everybody can be able to be in this place. But as we're speaking now, we have people who are joining us online. We have media representation in this room from different media houses. And we acknowledge the fact that through those channels, we're able to reach out to those who have not been able to come physically in a room like this one. But that, having said that, does not limit our work in terms of the reach that we need to make sure that we're reaching as many citizens as possible through the work that we do, our programming. And therefore, media plays a big role, not only just in the broader discourse of things in enabling conversations and engagements as citizens and civil society and political parties, but also helping us to reach those other segments of our population that we cannot be able to reach at any point in time. And so we acknowledge the role that they play in our work for the last 30 years, and even more importantly in this year. We were able to convene different gatherings from the beginning of the year to the almost the last day of the election, and we were able to reach more than 80 journalists that worked with DDP consistently from the beginning of the year, worked with different media houses, and helped us to give out that information, disseminate that information on voter education and the importance of voting and all those things that we had to say to make it work for citizens to make informed decisions on the day of the election. So I really want to thank you, those who are in this room and those who are watching online from the different media houses who really appreciate the work of DDP and have come on board as partners with the right attitude, and that the right attitude is to, we are partnering with us to help us build our democracy, consolidate it, and defend it from any threats. And so our meeting this morning, our conversation this morning is very, very, very much focused on the role of the media played in our elections. And I'm very optimistic on the conversation we're going to have in this room, given the lineup that we were able to put together for this morning. And I would like us to engage with them and engage with the content that they're going to present to us, so that we leave this room with some understanding of the role that the media will continue to play even after the elections, because the work still starts again. We have just completed one election, and in less than 2 years' time, we are going into another election. So it's also very critical, and we need to get ourselves ready, because actually what really happens on the last day of the election is made up of what happens in between elections. You complete one, and before you know, you start to get into the next one. And with the conversations that have now started about the political landscape that is changing, and we are not going to go back to where we were, can I show you that? We are now going to develop this new emerging political engagement and landscape that we're going to work with towards 2026, perhaps even 2029. But there's a lot of work to be done now in between. First of all, for sustaining the consciousness that we as citizens and civil society, we have a role to play in making this democracy work. And even this new emergence that is coming up now, we still have a very critical role to play. And I hope that the conversation today will not only enlighten us around those issues of our participation, but the critical role that the media plays in between the elections. And of course, I'm very much aware that this landscape has also contributed significantly to how the media houses are going to position themselves. New threats are emerging. One of them is the use of the artificial intelligence. And you can start imagining what that looks like, and I will leave the experts to talk about that. But even the other threat that we witnessed during the work that we've done in the past 6 months with the media house that we work with is the potential of media houses to be almost coerced to take particular narratives. As my colleague Brian has just mentioned, he who pays the piper also sometimes asks you to dance their tune. And I hope our presenters today will also delve into that, because it's a serious threat if it continues as a trend on how funders of media houses can influence political narratives. And we as citizens, on the other end, we are consuming information with a particular angle that has been presented to us. And that's a threat to what we think the role of media going forward will look like. And so, on behalf of the DDP team that has worked very hard in the last 6 to 8 months to make this work, because preparations of these kind of things take quite time, in the midst of other things that we've done, I really want to thank our team, and I would like you to give them a round of applause for working so hard to make this. Should you go ahead and give them a round of applause? Putting this together, but also importantly, as I take my seat, to encourage you to engage, even amongst yourselves, and enjoy our hospitality. Thank you very much.
Testing 1 2. Testing 1 2. Am I audible in the back?
No.
Testing 1 2. Testing 1 2. The mic, Dr. Kariuki was sabotaged by the media as part of your presentation. I do apologize for that. And we apologize to our online audience as well as our radio partners in Under FM. We're hosting this gathering in partnership with Under FM, who are broadcasting parts of this gathering live on their platform. Some of you would know they are a leading community radio station competing with even the commercial radio stations in the province, and so we appreciate and are encouraging the continued partnership that we have with them. So the program today will be in 3 segments. Those 3 segments will be an opening sort of keynote address by Prof. Anton Harbour, and then we'll have 2 sessions, both of which were meant to be panel discussions, but we'll see how that goes. I think we have representation for the first session, and then we also have a representative present for the second session, which will be part of the panel discussion. But I think the second session is no longer a panel discussion, it's just GCIS on their own, but we are looking forward to how it is that they were able to handle communications from a government perspective. We know that we have a president, but we also recognize that we don't have, for instance, a cabinet and the appropriate political deployees. But in the absence of those individuals, government's work needs to continue to happen. So the administrators were very important as well, just in general and about informing citizens about the role that they ought to be playing, as well as the role that institutions such as the IEC continue to play in the absence of partisanship. So regardless of who's in political leadership, the work of government continues, and so it's important to hear also from GCIS in terms of what role they saw for themselves and so for the rest of us. We are very lucky as well to have commissioners in the room of various institutions, and we have, of course, our own communications people, including Taisha and Tabiso Mveve, who are leading this process from convening the Media Summit side. So we'd like to welcome, first off, Prof. Anton Harbour, in engaging us about the role of media in deepening democracy in South Africa, and reflections from the national and provincial elections 2024. Before Prof. Anton Harbour comes up, though, I just want to get a sense of how you're feeling about the coverage. Just maybe some introductory remarks, some things that you picked up from the media that you observed. What were some of the things that were concerning or interesting for you to pick up going to the elections, and of course the coverage during elections and a bit post the elections? Let me get a sense of the room, a bit of a reading of the room. Some of you would recognize that when we talk about the types of media that's involved, some of us think about quite clearly in terms of the ideology that specific media houses purport. We think about the US, for instance, with CNN being a very clearly democratic and sort of left-leaning media house, whereas you have Fox News, who is very conservative, right-leaning media house. They seem to tell very distinctly different narratives, but all of them tout objectivity, for instance, in the way in which they report. In the UK, you have your Sky News, which is right-leaning, very conservative, And it seems as though, and it's interesting from the BBC's perspective, because they're also a state-sponsored media house in some respects, so it's important to try and think about what that objectivity means in that context. In this country, we have had a history where it seemed as though we were moving towards that space as well. I'm giving the sound guys an opportunity to just swap that out, so that, so don't think I'm rambling for any reason. I'm not rambling at all. So we had AN7, which emerged out of the sort of 2014 to about 2018, and they led the charge in convening breakfasts on behalf of government, but it was interesting because they seem to have been the only ones who got that tender through the New Age breakfasts, and so they were presenting a specific narrative as well. But they got quickly shut down after the emergence of the potential relationship that existed between the former president and that administration, and ultimately what impact the type of news that they carried on their station had on the idea of objectivity. What has been your reading of our current news landscape as it relates to the elections that we had and are going to be having in future? Any hands? Are these mics good enough as well?
Yeah.
Cool.
I mean, as someone who's done a bit of work with the media also in the past election, for the past, I mean, we did a lot of work in the past 6 months in particular, providing political punditry and commentary. I mean, one thing about South Africa, I mean, the way you explain the media in other countries, but of course, I disagree a bit with your analysis of the NN7 situation, because I don't think it mattered much, their relationship with government, their relationship with the former president. What mattered was the political view they were bringing.
Yeah.
And in South Africa, there is this idea of one singular political view. And with the media, it claims to be objective, it claims to be critical, but it doesn't, right? It has long-held political views that need to be reinforced. You will see how particular people are treated when they're being interviewed. So there are people who are treated as state leaders, as community leaders, who must be afforded the opportunity to express themselves. But those they disagree with on long-held beliefs are, let me say it again. In terms of how they are being asked, because there is a particular view that the media wants to express, and they are not giving it. So, for example, if you look at the past few days, and the past few interviews that have been done, especially after the swearing in of the latest MPs, and you see the interviews that have been done, and you see how they have been done, and you see interviews before them, you will see that there clearly is a long-held political view. Whether that political view is correct or wrong, but it is there. And anyone who comes across as opposing must be exposed as someone who doesn't think, as someone who's too emotional. And that's one of the first things that we need to deal with. The other thing is, I mean, the analysis that we have done, some of us in the past 6 months, are also party-centric, right? They are party-centric, they are ruling party-centric. So we are unable to do a wide range of the political landscape and the events that unfold. We must analyze on the basis of the rule, on the form of the ruling party, and anyone who opposes that. We can't have a very open view of it, and that's problematic. The last thing is that, I mean, I don't want to accuse the media of not being theoretical, but you will see that some of us who do this media work, in the media there seems to be very limited theoretical questioning. Right? So for example, now we are speaking government of national unity. We are speaking whether or not the DA, we're not speaking state formation. What types of states emerges of government national unity? I mean, critical media, especially talk media, must be engaged in that type of work, but they are not. Right? We're engaged in potholes work, we're engaged in whether or not there will be corruption or not. We're not engaged on whether these elections, what type of state was there, the results thereof, what type of states do they bring to us, and what is this government of national unity, what states formation, what statecraft is coming, and what does the statecraft do? And all of those things are as a result of the fact that media also in some way or another participates in the deliberate miseducation of society. And that society doesn't want to speak real issues. It wants to speak potholes. Because the media makes them speak potholes.
Yeah, all right. Thank you very much, brother. A round of applause for Toban as a questions. Anyone else with a perspective? I think I definitely agree that there doesn't seem to be enough time created. GCIS seems to be doing good work, but also government, political party comms people do good work. And I'm saying this with a bit of an asterisk next to it. I say good work because it seems easy for the media to adopt the languaging of government communications, but also the languaging of political parties, even when that languaging is misleading and untrue. In the instance of government of national unity, for instance, we seem to have comfortably adopted this term without the theoretical understanding of what actually GNU ought to be meaning or does actually mean in the real world. But it seems we're going to run with it for the next 5 years, and then in 2029, we're going to be like, oh wow, it actually wasn't the government of national unity, and we're going to all be shocked. Yeah, okay.
Thank you. My name is Sitiliso from Happy Valley Radio. I think this time around this election, we really saw the state of social media. I think social media was more powerful than mainstream media. And we got to realize this when one of the social media content creators, Dan Core, was actually given a slot at ENCA to present his own show. I think the social media plays a role of just being more real and raw. And the people paying attention to the media, especially on social media, get the real facts, the real news, more than controlled media. I think a lot of people in this country feel as if your mainstream media is controlled and somewhat biased towards certain political parties such as the ANC and the DA. It's always to criticize them, but never to hear their actual policies. I don't think I've watched an interview where we've discussed the ANC's foreign policies full in depth. I think most of the work that Naledi Pandor done, I got to know through social media and the social media engagements that were currently happening. So we've seen a lot of media being taken to social media, which is very important because now it reaches more young people. And this time around in these elections, more young people were engaged in terms of what's happening in the media.
Thank you very much. The challenges with relying on one medium only, or particularly relying on social media, is that the truth has become contested in our politics generally, and so it's important to think about what impact the type of information we get and the sources of that information in terms of its ability to be verified. Any one last person, preferably female, or presenting as female, let me not make it prejudgment. Anyone else with any reflections? All right, let me call Prof. Anton Harbour for his opportunity. Prof. Anton Harbour is a Caxton Professor of Journalism. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. He was a co-founder and editor of the anti-apartheid newspaper. Is this outdated? But yeah, he's essentially leading an organization called Freedom of Expression. But you'll correct me, Prof. I apologize for that. It was sent to me this morning. Let me blame other people. Welcome, Prof. Campaign for Free Expression. That's the. He's the executive director of that organization. A round of applause for him.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Thank you very much. You know, we have to fight disinformation all the time. I am no longer the Caxton Professor. I'm just ordinary Anton. I do run a couple of non-profit organizations like the Campaign for Free Expression and the Henry Ngumalo Foundation. But I am thankfully retired from the university. It's a great delight to be here today. see some old friends, hopefully meet some new friends, to be in Durban, my hometown. Always a pleasure to be here. And to engage in, I can sense from the input already that we're in for some fascinating debate and discussion around the role the media is or should be playing, and I look forward to it. Let me start by saying that the media has got multiple roles to play in an election. And let me just outline what I see those as being, because we're going to test it against those categories. First of all, there's a need for civic and voting education. There's no question that the media is critical in getting people aware of the need to vote, the complexities of voting, and everything related to that. Second of all, and I put the second because I think it's very important, the media's watchdog role. It needs to keep a close watch on the IEC to make sure they do their task fully and properly, and on all the political parties and their adherence to codes of conduct and the rules of an election. It's through the media that we find out if the IEC is not operating properly or if parties are breaking the rules. They have to cover all parties fairly, but also asking them tough questions on behalf of the public. So it was interesting that in the remarks we heard earlier, the word objective was thrown around. It's not a word I use because I don't think it's helpful in understanding the media and its role. Clearly all journalists, all media have a point of view. The question is not what their point of view is, but whether they try and achieve some level of fairness and accuracy and truth in what they speak. So when one criticizes, for example, we heard CNN described as left-wing and Fox as right-wing, but I would say there's another fundamental difference that we need to be aware of. I think that CNN tries to be as fact-based as possible. Whereas when I see Fox News, I see they're prepared to spread conspiracy theories about their elections and about migrancy in quite dangerous ways. And so I think the fundamental difference, that fundamental question one must ask, is whether an outlet or a journalist is committed as best they can within all the limits that any human individual or institution face, to be fair about establishing the truth and verifying facts and establishing accuracy. So when you talk about other voices, sometimes they're not just other voices, they're other voices that might be committed to disinformation, to malinformation, to harmfully spreading untruths, and that's what one needs to be really covering all the parties fairly, I said. The media clearly has to focus the debate, hopefully on policies rather than personalities. We heard that expressed. That there's not enough policy debate. There tend to be a focus on parties themselves and personalities. I would disagree with the critique that there's too much focus on things like potholes, because I think the fundamentals of daily life, water, health, electricity, roads, matter to people, and it's important that we cover that. We can't just cover at the super theoretical level. That day-to-day life is very important to coverage, and we mustn't diminish that. It affects all our lives, and we do very, very much care about it. And it's important that the media cover that as well. It's important that we reflect the diversity of views from the full range of South Africans, not just the usual voices, not just the urban elite, not just mature men like me, and not just expert communicators, but the range of South African views and people, young and old, male and female. all kinds, all sorts, all places, all geographies, all languages. And then the last important function that I think we're seeing is increasingly important is countering disinformation. We're seeing around the globe attempts to interfere with our elections by spreading disinformation, malignantly, harmfully, and the media, proper journalists, play a key role in building the trust that can counter disinformation. We all know this election was particularly tough for us all and for the media for a number of reasons specific to this election. Because it was more complicated with 3 ballots than we've had before, and we were all confused by that, and that's one gap in the civic education. Because, of course, of the proliferation of small parties, independent candidates, making it almost impossible to cover them all fairly. And you could debate what fair coverage would mean when you have so many parties and so many candidates. And, of course, new parties that sometimes get too much attention, sometimes too little attention, and journalists and editors have to make the decision about how important a new party is or might be, and how much attention it deserves. Of course, this is an election in which it became clear from quite early on that the governing party was likely to lose its majority, and since it's a party of liberation that has been in power for a long time, this is a testing time for any democracy. And I think it must be said that we came through this aspect of it well, that ANC accepted defeat graciously and calmly, and I think they must be commended for this. It could have gone another way, and it didn't. And it's notable that the democratic rules, unlike in places like the USA, where candidates don't always accept their defeat, it was accepted graciously by most in this country, and certainly by the ruling party. And I've said already, one of the tough aspects of this was the growing amount of disinformation by forces that often want to disrupt and distort our elections. But I think one also has to say, we all know this, but it needs to be said, that it's a particularly tough time for the news media. Our biggest news media is the SABC, with the biggest reach across the country. And we know it's been struggling with its financial viability and is under political pressure at all times to take sides and not be fair in covering the election. We are seeing and hearing reports that community media, which is an essential part, a very important part of our total media ecology, is struggling to survive. We've had a lot of community papers and community radio closing down, publishing less frequently, struggling to stay alive in the current economic climate. But what's different is that private commercial media is also struggling. We had an announcement just last week that 4 of the country's oldest and some of the most respected newspapers would be closing down their print editions and going online only. That wasn't a surprise, wasn't unexpected, we've seen it coming for some time, but it is significant in signalling what has happened within our industry and what in our assessment we need to take account of. And there is the phenomenon affecting all our media that was raised by the one speaker. Young people are increasingly getting their news from social media. The impact of influencers was significant in this election. The impact of influencers who are paid to support a political position is significant in this election, and we need to take that important shift into account. It was said just now that our coverage is determined by those who pay for it, and of course this is always the case. How one pays for one's news is critical to the shape of one's news. But the way we've generally counted it, the way we've generally dealt with that fact, is by promoting diversity, having enough different voices to allow us to choose what we consume, who we believe and who we trust. So if we know that ENCA takes a certain position, we have other choices to go to that enable us as consumers to inform ourselves, make our own decisions, and have a diversity of views and not just one view. And it's important to say this because it points to a deeper, more fundamental problem, which is that in this economic climate, with the difficulty the media is in, we have diminishing diversity in our mainstream media because we see operations in trouble, closing down, newsrooms shrinking, fewer journalists. And this is particularly true in areas like the community media that helps bring different views, different news, different voices to the fore. And that's a reality that we have to accept. We all thought 10, 15, 20 years ago that the internet would allow for much greater diversity, many more voices, democratization of the media. Sadly, we can see now that that hasn't been the case because it's become dominated by big tech global brands that are incredibly powerful, more powerful than most governments, and which have a growing and massive influence on the flow of information, certainly in our country. If we look, and let me just say that when one looks back over the issues of media coverage in the terms that I've outlined here, one can give no more than some observations because the detailed analysis, for example, of what voices were heard, what diversity there was in the news we got, is yet to come out because that takes a bit of time. So one can only offer a few observations. I would give the media a mixed report on how the election was covered and whether it played the role we should. I think we've already heard this morning generalizations talking about the media as a whole, and I think one has to be careful with that because we have a wide range of media. Some cover the election better than others. Some have different roles and positions from others. So one can make general observations, but I think one must be careful of generalizing about the media as a whole because it's a big group and some cover elections differently, better or worse than others. I will say that there was not enough voter education and the three-ballot system was not made clear to the voter, I believe. The SABC has a particular responsibility as the public broadcaster for civic and voter education. And while they did some of it, I don't think they met this obligation adequately. In general, though, the SABC, I think, tried to be fairly balanced and scrupulous in following the rules, in resisting political pressures. They did make a bad blunder, I think, when they banned a Democratic Alliance advert. There were many who didn't like that advert, and one's perfectly entitled not to like it. But what we can't have is the public broadcaster deciding what we should like and see and not in an election time when they have to treat everyone equitably and fairly. It's not their decision to make, it's for the voter to decide whether they like the advert and they like that political party and whether it will influence them. I think it was a bad mistake and it did harm to their reputation. And as you saw, they were very sharply reprimanded and had a heavy fine from the regulator for crossing that line. They also, there were attempts to intimidate the editor-in-chief by threatening him with a new security clearance just before the election. I don't think this was accidental, and I think these incidents harmed the SABC's attempts to be seen as open and fair. I think there were particular problems in covering opinion polls, as I found that many journalists did not know how to analyze and report on opinion polls. You can't just say this opinion poll says ANC is going to get 42%, You need to look at the sample, you need to look at who's paying for it, you need to look at the questions asked. That's the nature of critical journalism, so that you're informing the reader on the validity or lack of validity of those opinion polls. Because clearly some of them are better and more accurate and more believable and more trustworthy than others, and it should be the journalist's job to help you see and understand that. One publication even ran an opinion poll without saying who did the poll or who paid for it, hiding the fact that it appears that one political party had commissioned that one. So it was hard to see it as fair and objective. And I think that was clearly inappropriate. And that is something we need to be thinking about and addressing. Opinion polls can have an enormous influence on how voters behave and think, and therefore one has to cover them carefully, properly, accurately, etc. I do think, as is almost always the case in this country, we have a preponderance of some voices or some kind of voices over others. I'm not sure we had as diverse a range of views as we would like in our media. As I say, the careful analysis will come and will be more nuanced than I'm talking about, because clearly some people did better than others. In general, I would say, not enough women's voices, not enough young people's voices, youth voices, not enough non-urban voices. There were some who made attempts to find and reflect this kind of diversity, but that can be hard and expensive to do, and one must understand that, because our newsrooms are constrained at the moment by financial difficulties and have less capacity to do that, which is a very worrying issue. I think those attempts are spotty and occasional. The truth is, and we have to think about this and deal with it, we are a grossly unequal society, and the media in general continues to reflect and sometimes reinforce that. And that's an ongoing problem that needs to be part of our analysis and understanding. As a whole, then, we must recognize that the mainstream media is not what it was, and it no longer sets the agenda the way it did in the past. The big change that we need to think about in our deliberations today is how the size and power of the big tech platforms, the global platforms such as Facebook, Google, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, WhatsApp, I think plays an enormous role today in how we communicate politically and socially around elections. They are scooping up all the advertising. They are scooping up the news generated by our local media and not paying for it. They are making good profits in our country, and they don't pay any tax. These big tech platforms, WhatsApp, Facebook, were the main carriers of disinformation and disruption in the election period. They all said they took measures to prevent it, and me and my organization tried hard to hold them to account for it. And we asked questions of them. We have given access to information requests to them. We've taken them to the information regulator now to make them answer those questions about exactly what they did, what disinformation they found, what measures they took, how many people they had working on it, what languages they worked in. Because we know a lot of disinformation happens in languages other than English, in order to make it harder for the platforms to discern. So it's very important that when one searches for, and I say disinformation, I also mean hate speech, harassment of journalists and politicians and figures, all the nasty stuff that can come in social media. If you're not looking at languages other than English, then you are in danger of missing a great deal of it. And we don't know what languages these platforms monitor in. It's very hard to hold them to account. We found they are secretive. about what steps they've taken to prevent online disinformation, hate speech, and election disruption. So they say to us, just trust us. We do all we can. Our view is you can't trust them. They've shown themselves to be untrustworthy, and this is something we need to address. We need to hold them accountable for their role in our elections, in our news systems, and our information systems. This, I think, now is the growing and critical issue in our media. Are we ready to deal with these big platforms and make them take responsibility for their content and be accountable for it and their conduct? Will they tell us what steps they are taking to stop disinformation and disruption and work with us on that? There is the global movement to take on these issues and ask these questions and force them to a level of accountability. In Europe, Australia, Indonesia, others taking the lead in this. And we, as a country, need to decide whether we are joining that global movement. The reality is the big tech platforms are undermining our local news market and distorting it financially and therefore with wide implications in other ways. And this impacts on our election coverage. If our local news is in trouble because of these big tech platforms, if local news is shrinking and deteriorating, our local news structures, newsrooms, journalists are shrinking, our democracy and our economy are in trouble. Without a rich, strong, active, diverse local news operation, we can't operate successfully in our economy and in our democracy. It's an essential tool, it's an essential part of these processes, and I'm terribly concerned that we're seeing the shrinkage of our local news industry because of the impact of the big tech platforms. Are we ready to take these global giants on, make them accountable for their content and their behavior? I think that in general we need to make our society and our government realize that news is not just another commodity like baked beans or motor cars or something like that. It should be treated as a social and economic necessity. A social necessity like water and electricity and good roads. And we need as a society not to say that this is the problem of the news industry, but to see it as a national, social, political, economic problem for us in our country. And we need to find new ways, imaginative, creative new ways to sustain our local media industry and not let it continue to deteriorate and harm our democracy and our economy. We don't want to be in a position for the next elections where our local news media is so weak that all of these functions I'm talking about, we can complain about them in various ways, but that we have a media that's fundamentally unable to serve these important political, social, economic functions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. If you could grab a seat there, Prof. Just at the front there, sorry. Another round of applause from Prof. Harbour. If there are any direct questions to Prof in reflection to his presentation, I'd appreciate that very much if you could raise your hand, and I'd be able to then direct my question to you. Yes, yes. And maybe two more hands as a direct reflection from Prof's presentation. All right, thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Yassine Parza from the Qatar Freedom Party. I quite enjoyed what you said, Prof, on limiting and possibly looking at these social media platforms that are limiting our growth locally for journalists, etc. However, with the closure of publications, That is quite alarming when we no longer have curated media for individuals who require a curated set. It's much better in that way also to ensure that we don't have fake news and that we do not have disinformation spread as easily. The only other issue that I find, Prof, how do we as a country, without limiting media's freedom, how do we regulate that every person that becomes a media practitioner or calls themselves a journalist subscribes to a set of rules and values, that of which is the South African National Editors Forum, for instance, or the Press Ombudsman, for instance, or the Information Regulator, for instance, which have become, in real terms, almost toothless organizations. And we are not, every, can you say, Tom, Dick, and Harry has become a podcaster or a media practitioner, or starting an online radio in my bedroom, and I'm spreading information and I speak with authority and confidence in certain things that I have no idea what's happening, and I don't subscribe to a set of values that are enshrined within, what editors need to take account for and that can be held accountable. And how do we hold those individuals accountable? Because not only are platforms such as the social media platforms, I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily. It is opening up a space for our young people that 10 years ago we didn't have. And it has helped with innovation. But how do we control this? Because you cannot then place a body onto the media, because that would be in the media, right? You can't make a Chapter 9 institution in Parliament, because how would you have a chairperson, how would they be held accountable in Parliament when that already would impede on media freedom in the country? So is there a sense of how do we deal with this? And what have you been reading on it? Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carter. Really happy to have you here.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Silene. I'm an independent freelancer. My question is almost similar to this one that I was just asked. In terms of social media influencers and the fact that youngsters are now just taking all sorts of information from the internet and they're regarding it as newsworthy. I mean, I think number one, you can't really blame the youngsters, also known as the 2000, because at the end of the day, they were born in a world that's digital. They were born in an era whereby we are no longer doing much of newspapers and print or tangible media outlets, right? They were born in an era where everything is online. They don't even play games outside. The games they play are online. You know what I mean? So we can't, I don't know, I get that point and I kind of agree with this, but I'm asking, how do we then bridge that gap from a generation that was born into the digital world, and how do we now say they should stop taking information from social media or online seriously, or considering everything as newsworthy where they were born into the area? And then the social media followers, social media influencers, they do not hire themselves, for lack of a better word. It is the media houses and political parties who actually pay these influencers to go and say stuff on the internet as to which party to vote for, which what's it called? Which manifesto to follow or believe, and so why do we as media houses do that same thing and then come back to be like, oh no, youngsters are following everything from social media and taking it seriously, whereby we are the ones who put the social media influencers in that space from the get-go, because there are journalists who are also influencers. Why not use those journalists with credible sources, with credible degrees or qualifications? Why are we then taking random, as to your words, Tom, Dick, and Harrys, and making them the stars of the media and putting them out there? So essentially my question is, with the digital world being faster and more convenient, we're seeing publications are closing down because everything is moving online. How do we then separate, how do youngsters then separate from news that's deemed as newsworthy and fake news? How will they know that, okay, this is fake news, this is real, this is what I'm supposed to be following, this I should disregard, because are we even training them as to how they should spot if news are fake, or if it's newsworthy, or if it's something true or relevant, or it's been credited? Are we training them on how to spot those things, or we are just expecting the youngsters to sort of know that by themselves, that okay, I shouldn't be following this, because there is a problem like that, I think we can all agree, but how will the youngsters know that this is a page I should not be following because it's doing fake news, or this is a page that's credible that I can actually trust with the news, because everything is online and we cannot run away from that in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comment or question? It's interesting, Prof. One of the things you mentioned earlier around sort of demystifying the idea of objectivity, you were talking about consuming media in its diversity is one of the important things that you have the ability to gauge. And interestingly, with the online community, credibility is not the primary driver for the success of social media campaigns or people. It's all about popularity and how the content is delivered. Even when it's not credible, the way in which the content is delivered drives people towards that platform. It would be interesting to see what are the drivers of engagement with mainstream media in the absence of credibility.
Good morning, everybody. Tim Cleverton, Happy Valley Radio. Prof, my question is, be it written or electronic media, how influential has the media been on the election of 2024? Did the media, in actual fact, play a significant role in swinging the pendulum in the way the election has mattered out?
Thank you very much. I think we'll stop there. Thank you very much for your contributions and questions. Prof, over to you with any reflections on that basis.
Thank you. Interesting and complex questions. Let me try and address them. But let me first make another appeal that you stop calling me Prof. My name is Anton. Okay, and the first question is about how do we regulate these many voices? Because although I said the internet isn't what we expected it to be in terms of democratizing the media space, we do have to remind ourselves that it brings enormous value. It's fantastic that you and everyone and me can just go online, go on Twitter, go and express ourselves and put out a point of view. And there's something wonderful about that breaks down the traditional role of media as gatekeepers of opinion. It hasn't played out the way we'd hoped, but the internet is clearly a fantastic and powerful tool, particularly for journalists. And although I'm grappling with the problems and the issues, we need to be reminded of that. The issue of how we manage, regulate, control the internet, because we learn it all the time how dangerous it can be, how dangerous Instagram can be for young people, for example, and their mental health, how dangerous disinformation can be in disrupting our society and our elections. Look, the first choice for me would be self-regulation. First choice would be to get the platforms to regulate themselves. Now, a critical factor is that, when I publish a newspaper or broadcast from a radio station, I have to take responsibility for the content and can be held responsible by the law or the public. In many ways, I'm held responsible for what I do, and therefore I have to be careful. The problem with the internet is that these big platforms are not responsible for their content. They are not, because of something called Section 230, a US law which said that the internet is more like a telephone and it's not media. And telephones don't take responsibility for what you say on the telephone. But media does take responsibility for its content. And I think that's a problem, because I think increasingly these platforms are media rather than just platforms. and there's a need to make them take responsibility. Now, they have to some extent started to self-regulate and take responsibility. They are taking measures. They resisted in the beginning, but political and social pressure got them to take some responsibility, particularly after the American elections, in which it was felt that that foreign powers had used Facebook in particular to distort the American elections and the outcome of the 2016 elections and the British Brexit votes. But our view is that it's not enough. They do only what they're forced and pressurized to do. A key factor is making them take responsibility for their content. That's difficult and that's complicated. To give you an idea of the complications for us in South Africa, when we put questions to them about their what they were thinking about the elections, they said, our headquarters are in another country, all their data is in another country, and therefore South African laws don't apply to them. We can't get access to information right to those issues. So there's issues of tough jurisdiction. But I think that's the route. We have to say you've got to take responsibility for content. The day that happens, it changes. Because then if they're going to get into trouble for spreading hate speech, for example, they will take serious steps to stop it, not just the minimum steps they take now. You're right, we can't blame young people for being entirely digital. That's the way of the world. We might prefer them to behave in other ways, but young people are young people. That's the culture they're born into, that's how it's going to be. We have to adapt how we do news and journalism and how we manage our information system on that reality. I think there's a number of things we can do, and I think you pointed to one of them. Media literacy. We need to be teaching in our schools and our universities and our factories and our workplaces media literacy. How to understand the media, its role, how it's done, what to be wary of, how to read it critically, how to tell disinformation from real information, how to be hygienic about one's media consumption. No question, we need that. It's not a solution on its own, but it would help. We need to strengthen ethical, professional journalism, because the counter is to have institutions and voices and individual journalists that we know and trust and can believe. It doesn't mean they won't make mistakes, but it means we can trust them to fix mistakes when they make them, as opposed to those who are deliberately spreading misinformation. So the strength of our legitimate professional news industry is critical to that. So these are all things we're grappling with. We may eventually need to regulate, but I always prefer self-regulation of the media to regulation, because you have to be careful of giving governments and politicians too much power over our media and our opinions and what we learn and hear. The last question was, how influential is the media in swinging the election pendulum? That's always a hard thing to assess. But I did say, and I think it's true, that the mainstream media is not as powerful and influential as it was. The exception is probably the SABC, because it still has the widest reach of all, whereas something like the Sunday Times or the Daily Sun has much less reach these days and much less capacity to set the agenda. So we're in a changing position where the mainstream has less influence, still has some to frame political information and debate, but the power of the internet is just there and it's growing, and a lot of it is growing without gatekeepers on the news. So I'm sorry I can't give you a clearer answer on that, because it's difficult and it's complex, and I believe we're in a transitional stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm sorry. Anton Harper is going to discipline me similarly to how formerly Judge President of the Western Cape High Court was able to discipline certain members of the media earlier this week about how to address him. Thank you very much for your presentation. A round of applause for Mr. Anton Harper as he makes his way to his seat. Now I'm going to call upon Ms. Yanga Madodana, who is a project manager for ESI Press, based at the University of Pretoria, who's going to be chairing the next session. Just maybe as an interesting parting shot, part of what I hope that we can be able to talk about as it relates to media is the urban bias, the lens through which most mainstream media, if you look at prime time slots, your 6, 7 p.m. in the evening, your afternoon drives, your morning shows, they seem to talk broadly about the 5 or 4 major cities in this country without necessarily engaging with the context that the majority of our population lives under. Yes, we have an urban density issue as it relates to where people live and reside and work, but the stories from rural areas in particular don't make it onto the mainstream media with the intensity and the analysis that it requires. And ultimately, it means that we have our sort of a blind spot as it relates to a large part of this country. And the people and the stories and sort of the humanity of those who live in those spaces is lost upon us. And so I hope that we'll be able to discourse about that as well over the course of the day. I think some of that could help us understand where the dynamics are as it relates specifically also to the results of this election. And so, Ms. Yanga, welcome. A round of applause for Yanga, please. Let me just... Sure.
A very good morning, everybody. Molweni, I hope you're all doing well. I do not like Durban weather, so I'm very much suffering in the moment. Every time I come here, I sweat like I just came out of the gym. But I've been here for enough hours to feel a little bit more calm. It's always lovely being here. I feel like for some reason Durbanites are always so happy because the weather is so warm. But every time I'm here, I can't wait to go back and enjoy the cold and know exactly how to dress up. So my session is actually going to be super fun because I don't have to do much because of the powerhouse of the speakers that we have. But we're going to go into the idea of whether or not media has been bullied. I don't know if media has the power to bully, but whether or not media has been bullied during this election season and perhaps any times past that, beyond the election season, and also how to navigate. I think it came up in the previous conversation, this map of misinformation and disinformation. And even importantly, how to distinguish between the two and perhaps how media has played a role in doing that. I am not going to do speaker bios because of mistakes that were done in the previous session. I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves because I do not want to get anything wrong. But our first speaker is Nomshado from Media Check, who has a presentation. So we're just going to hear your presentation first, and then me and you and Jacob are going to sit up on stage and we are going to have a very fun chat with very fun questions, I think, about this topic of bullying and countering misinformation. So over to you. Don't forget to introduce yourself because I have it. That's your number one role to do up here. So give it up for a non-shot, everybody.
I think bios will be the key word for today. I am from Media Monitoring Africa. My name is Nomchato Mbisungosungulu and I am the head of communications there. And I think just because of the topic that we're about to discuss, my bio will end there. So as long as you know where I'm from and you know my position there, that's amazing. So just to give a bit of a quick background about Media Monitoring Africa, we have been operating since 1993. And this was on the basis that our media was moving into, away from, the apartheid system in terms of media freedom into a democratic era. And we wanted to see how will SABC fare when it comes to reporting on our new democratic elections at that point. We have been monitoring media coverage since 1993, so meaning we've monitored every single election that we've held since then, and we've also monitored in terms of other different societal issues. However, we can all agree, obviously, with the new digital era, there was a new form of information dissemination. So that has also been an area that we've been coming into in terms of civic tech tools and navigating that landscape of information. Okay, I'm going to spend 2 seconds here because I believe Anton has done an amazing job of really building the context in which we're operating in. But I want to highlight a few elements that we really need to be kind of aware of when we're saying, mis and disinformation and, the different issues that we're dealing with in the media landscape. So first of all, I think it was highlighted that we're dealing with an explosion of information, right? Making it very difficult for somebody, especially if we're talking about Ugogo, in the rural area, or even the young ones, to be able to disseminate what is credible information and what is not. So going back to understanding that as we're sitting in South Africa, never mind as an African continent, we are dealing with a digital divide. So people don't have access to information the same way if we're talking technology. People don't have the same access, to digital literacy and media literacy the same way that others do in different parts of the country. So that is critical in understanding how people actually end up consuming information, but not forgetting to actually highlight the offline interactions as well, and context heavily. But reality is we all meet up in different informal settings and share information via word of mouth. And I think this is where some of the narratives around disinformation I'll be highlighting on. Second to this, the public is very overwhelmed. I think COVID was a perfect example of this. How confusion, fear, anxiety, and all can really even go into the way that we receive news and interpret it as well. Lastly, and I think this is quite key and critical to highlight, and I think Anton did already, we've got a huge issue of declining journalists in this space. And this is worrisome because I've been in a number of settings, with SANF as an organization, really stating that, we were at 15,000 journalists, if I stand to be corrected, 10 years ago, and currently sitting we're just over 5,000. So clearly that indicates and shows how, the landscape on its own is really changing in terms of the capacity that's also behind it, never mind the sustainability issue. So this is just a quick one. I like using that image in particular because it's always the question of is it real, is it not, was he really being chased by police, etc. For the realization of the impact of digital media. From a global context to a local context, these are 2 different experiences. As much as we're all gunning for the same thing, and I think Anton mentioned that around self-regulation. But I'm going to focus today on number 1, the online harms that we experience during elections, and just give a bit of an intro to that as well. Second to that, the issues around attacks on journalists, and yes, they were there and they were quite a lot. I'm not going to go into that, I'll just skip a bit there. I want to pause here for a reason. I know some of you might even know the definitions at the back of your head. But because in different settings, we always use fake news interchangeably with disinformation. And I think we really need to understand the difference in what we're dealing with. I myself, even as an organization, don't like using the term fake news because it's a term that has been used by those in power to deflect accountability, right? And to even state that news can be fake, and yes, they're not perfect and they can get it wrong, but they are the literal foundation of a democracy when it comes to information. So what we're dealing with here is disinformation. So this is deliberate content or information that is created to cause harm. And in an election context, that harm can come in different forms. How it thrives and how it spreads is through misinformation. So this is me sharing without the intent and without the knowledge that this was deliberately created to cause harm. So this is where you start seeing, platforms such as WhatsApp come into play, because this is a direct messaging tool, end-to-end encrypted. It's your own personal space, and it's people that you trust. Where we also start seeing a lot of harassment, hate speech elements coming into play is malinformation, which we don't speak about a lot. And this is actually true information that's used to cause harm. So the spread of somebody's personal information online to cause attacks on them online and offline is where we start seeing the usage of malinformation. I thought I should just spend 2 seconds helping to kind of get the definitions out so that we can start unpacking the different examples. This is just a quick explainer on how does it work, how are these narratives created, and I think it also helps you to understand why is it that they easily thrive the way they do. Reality is we're living in a very vulnerable environment. Never mind our socio-economic issues and challenges, but second to that, we all know the different electoral changes, the different information that came about during the election period was also overwhelming, creating the perfect space and gap and emotional setting for these narratives to actually thrive. And I also want to pause here. Each and every one of us is operating within an echo chamber, right? An echo chamber which is bouncing back information, narratives, and content that you actually like interacting with. So you will be actually engaging with different social media profiles or platforms that even suggest the content for you, right? Understanding that these echo chambers also have their own influential individuals. Every time we speak about influencers, we always speak about it from the context of this should be somebody with a large following on social media. But we never actually even focus on the nano and the ones in the middle. So these are people with 5 to 10K followers who actually also do have some form of influence within their echo chamber. Because this is information that I interact with every day on my feed, that I trust. I see keywords that I resonate with. So clearly this is information that I can interact with. And I think by helping to kind of understand the landscape of how we're in pockets within our own digital spaces is also quite key, because it goes back to understanding that we're all living in a digital citizenship form when we're online. And I think that's where the responsibility that bounces back towards ourselves comes into play when it comes to ensuring that the information that we share is credible. I think to run through this, we all spoke about the lack of strong digital media literacy skills, and also second to that, the important role that media plays in terms of disseminating credible information. I think these elections was one of the elections where we really started seeing the role of social media itself come into play. And media having to position itself as a kind of the mechanism that deflects credible information against these narratives. And I'll touch on a few of those narratives also for you to see. Some of the solutions that we've in fourfolds at MMA that we focused on during pre-elections, during elections, and post-elections is looking at how do we ensure that we all have amazing organizations that are doing amazing work around, media credibility, combating online harms, and so forth. The issue was that we're all working in silos, and we're all actually only having an impact story within our little echo chambers. And the reality is that we're all serving the same purpose, which is to protect our democracy. So how do we bring all those organizations together to ensure that, number one, we're bringing our resources to one table, but we're sharing our information as well at the same time. So we formed what we called a disinformation working group for the 2024 elections that had different organizations such as Africa Check, DFR Lab, that has to do with a lot of behavioral analysis, SANIF, obviously media needs to be there as well, RRC bringing in the legal element, to name a few. But I think the first part of that I want to focus on is in 2021, we were able, which is just the first, and it's not necessarily the big solution, but it's a first step to actually getting to where we need to be, is we were able to bring all the social media platforms to the table to say that, number one, disinformation during the elections is a big threat towards our democracy. Second to that, a narrative that thrives even more than 15 minutes on social media has done its job, has done its harm. How do we ensure that we're taking down these narratives swiftly? And how do we ensure that these takedown notices are actually given the attention that they are needed? So we formed what we called a framework of cooperation with the different social media tech platforms, inclusive of Google, Meta, TikTok, and X at that time. However, for the 2024 framework of cooperation, we still have the same platforms except for X. And this is obviously because due to the ownership changes and the different drastic changes that X has gone through for the past few years, there is no African policy team that we can directly communicate to like we did previous times. As I said, this is a first step of many. There's a lot of issues that need to be, I think, dismantled, and I think Anton also touched on a few responsibilities that they need to also, or accountability rather, that they need to take up in form. Local innovation was one of the things that we also looked into. So how do we use the very same technology to actually start assisting us to, combat the issues that we're looking at, or to even start analyzing the issues that we're looking at. A lot of people, when they hear AI, it's either they run away in the room or hide themselves under the table, or they also see the opportunity that it actually presents as well. So these are some of the civic tech tools that we actually created, and I'll touch on a few of those based on the findings as well that we've had during elections. Third to that is the monitoring, analysis and producing of live data. So during the election period, we actually have, and it's still live right now on our website, a dashboard that actually shows you how media is faring when it comes to media coverage. So looking at topics, looking at whose voice is the loudest, looking at which political parties were giving the most platform. This was also to kind of give media a chance to start reflecting on their performance as we're in the heat of the moment. And last but not least is campaigning, understanding that we need to move away from individual campaigning but cross-campaigning. And really building that ownership when it comes to content. We assume that we do an amazing graphic and amazing video, that people will consume it the way that we envision. But at the end of the day, they don't find meaning. And this goes back to we need to start promoting constitutionalism. Why should I care about this thing called democracy? Why should I care about the mandate of media? Why should I try to understand that when I see a journalist being attacked online, that I also have a responsibility to not be part of that attack, which is bringing back the citizen back to the forefront, to the center of all the efforts that we're doing. So this is the tool called Dexter. I'm not going to focus on it because I was given a mandate to speak on mis and disinformation, but because we're speaking about how media has been faring and looking at the live data and analysis, so this is a tool that we use when it comes to media monitoring in conjunction with human media monitors who actually go through and sift through the data that has been collected. Currently, we've got over 3 million curated stories within Dexter, and our live dashboard looks like this if you go to our website. So as you can see, you can select which media house you're interested in. You can select and go through in terms of political parties, voices, etc. In terms of coverage. So this is part of our interim report. We are going to release a final report towards the end of July. So this is just some of the findings that we found midway to us having our final report. And I think it was highlighted that, interestingly enough, even with the complexity of these elections, that voter education and registration was actually one of the least areas of focus when it came to media. And looking at, which is the journal that we've been seeing over the years, political party campaigning, the politics around that, the manifestos, and even service delivery being at 4% at midway, looking at how we're holding power to account, how we're engaging with their policies and constitutions. One of the, I think all of us at MMA, when we have to present this part of findings, it's always sad because this has never really moved much over the years. It's always been women's voices less at 20%, and having male voices at 84%. And knowing very well that there are, experts, female experts, academics, political leaders themselves, young women in the space as well, and really trying to push the momentum of we need to start leveling the play. We need to start having diverse voices and representation into the space. So as I said, my focus today will be around Bill 411, which was a platform that was initiated or rather launched in 2019 in partnership with the IEC. In 2018, what we started realizing that number one, we had a huge rise of mis and disinformation within the space. However, there was no local solution. the issue of language. If I come across a narrative in his class, how do I navigate the reporting system of that? Also looking at different platforms have different community guidelines and have different definitions for the different harms as well, away from our constitution or what our human rights basis says. So this platform is formed around that, in the sense that, number one, citizens themselves, it's a public platform that citizens themselves can actually upload and submit complaints around any of the online harms, harassment, hate speech, incitement, and mis- and disinformation. However, my focus for today would be mis- and disinformation. The behind the scenes of this is that, number one, it goes through a review system where it has 3 experts, a media, tech, and law. Then it goes through a secretariat. However, during during elections rather, it has a different system whereby it does go to the IEC for comment. And thereafter, if it's either a takedown notice, we obviously liaise with the different social media platforms, or if it's the issuing of an alert, or even might be found that it wasn't mis- and disinformation after investigation. As I said, this year it was really powerful because behind the system we had different organizations who have different elements of fact-checking and analysis, and even having media themselves coming to the space was quite important. The platform itself looks like this. It's not only a reporting mechanism, but as well it is a media and digital literacy platform. So it has modules and different areas where people can actually go in to test themselves in terms of spotting real to dodgy news, and as well as the transparency factor of being able to actually engage with the different complaints that have been submitted. You don't see the details of who submitted the complaints, because that's only at the back-end system for them to know the outcome of the complaint. What you see in the forefront is the different complaints, the different trends, the different keywords, the different hashtags that have been used to push certain narratives. And as I said, the form looks like this, and next to each there's a criteria as to assist an individual to kind of place where the content might fall either. Where they saw this is quite important, because I think we can all agree that different platforms pose different challenges when it comes to combating and mitigating disinformation. And importantly as well, what language was it in, and then obviously this would then be translated at the back end. We received a huge influx of complaints during the election week, particularly from Monday. That's when we were starting to deal with a lot of narratives, and I'll go through, I think there is a word map that I also included here, mainly being number one, really attacking the integrity of the IEC and their capability of producing a free and fair election, looking at the logistics as well. And what we started seeing as well was the fine line of fact versus opinion. And this is the issue that we deal with also when we're online, as was mentioned earlier. Social media is a great platform for all to exercise our right for freedom of expression. But once somebody starts fine-tuning that line of producing disinformation as a fact and kind of mask it over as an opinion, that's where we started seeing a lot of these narratives come through. Some of the narratives or content or graphics that we also started seeing was individuals creating or producing rather results. We saw this a lot on TikTok. Obviously, we're all aware that the international voting took place first, and we all know that the results were not obviously published at that point, but we started seeing a lot of videos, a lot of graphics of people stating, percentages and vote counts and so forth. And you would assume that everyone understands that there were no results published at that point, but because voter education is one of the issues, the understanding of not everything that I see should be taken at face value was also an issue. The issue of media and digital literacy is also still a very big issue. That if I came across this and I did not know anything, I would assume, okay, I kind of have a sense of who's leading and who's not. And this is quite dangerous during an election period, because once the actual results do come out, the person is still stuck with these narratives that were created, obviously to disrupt opinion or perspective or views. This was I'll skim through Padre, but one of the things that we also started seeing from a global perspective, we see influence. This is political aspect, right? From a local perspective, I think it was the first that we're actually able to see which political parties were running ads on which platforms. looking at access to information, but also looking at the transparency behind it. Because once again, the issues around algorithms, why am I seeing these ads so many times on this platform, will actually help somebody understand and navigate this. For data scientists, obviously this is a different meaning because they can actually start looking into the stats behind it, the type of content, and the spend as well. My focus as well would be on this, and I'm so sorry for skimming, it is a mouthful, but I'm happy to engage afterwards, was back then, I couldn't access a journalist, during our traditional media era, because this was all newspaper, this was all magazine, this was all TV, right? Now journalists themselves have public platforms which they engage in, and they can actually be interacted with by different public citizens. Then the problem becomes that once they start obviously now publishing different articles and narratives around elections, and some individuals find that they don't like the perspective or they don't like the facts that were presented, that this presents a perfect opportunity of attack. And what we saw is, and this is once again an interim report which will have a final report towards the end of July, we saw over 700 online attacks against journalists. And the worrisome thing is, and the worrisome trend is that we've seen these trends, these attacks rather, particularly towards female journalists, right? And the scary part is, I was going to share the type of narratives that were used against them, but I'd rather let you go and interact with them because for some it might be too sensitive. Is that they dehumanize the journalists themselves, they discredit them for the work that they do, but most importantly, they use malinformation to personally attack them as well. So it goes beyond the journalists to even their family members, their spouses, their children, where their children go to school. And that type of information being out on a social media platform, a public platform such as that, is very scary for somebody's safety. And I think we can all agree, if you were in that position, you wouldn't even feel safe, right? And I think it's important to echo that these attacks are continuous. And part of why Mars was there was, number one, to create a public archive that we can actually start seeing who are the actual attackers. Second to that, to also create an archive to have actually an evidence archive hub when it comes to any action that needs to be taken. And to end up there, from a media perspective and understanding the role that media plays, every workshop, every panel, every roundtable, we always emphasize that where you get your credible information from should be media, whether it's from a traditional sense or a digital sense. Second to that, you would rather be last and correct and first and wrong as media. Because reality is South Africa, or not even South Africa, citizens remember you're wrong. Your credibility is your new currency. And that's the reality of it as well, building that trust with citizens and with society. Last to that is realizing that because we're dealing with different online harms, the way that we actually start reporting on issues is quite important. Events-based reporting is something that was done, I think, historically as a way of being first. Right now, we need more contextualized reporting, helping citizens understand the relevance of the issue, the historical nature of the issue, and how it impacts on society. And I think this is why the continuous understanding that media plays a critical role and how we should also support media in terms of sustainability, but also the big word being how they adapt to this digital disruption that we find ourselves in when it comes to information dissemination is important. One last note, I had to touch on this. One of MMA's programs is working with children around media and digital literacy, and we actually did a study around their consumption of news on social media, right? And this was interesting because we started looking at how they interlink news and entertainment, and how they actually consume it based on the influences that the different, I think there was a lady that mentioned there. But that also poses a nice, exciting challenge to say, how do I adapt our news in such a manner that children can actually find relevance and link their voices to as well. And Leading to that as well, it's just to announce that, as I said, end of July, we are going to have the final reports in terms of media coverage and as well as around mis and disinformation. And I think I will stop there because I can go on all day. Thank you.
How you spread like wildfire, that the results were incredible, and how that information was propagated. How do you think, firstly, public perception is viewing the relationship between media and the IEC? But also, secondly, how did the IEC respond to those challenges that were spreading like wildfire on social media?
All right, thank you very much. Good morning, guys. I'm Jovial Randau, and I'm from the Communications Unit at the IEC. I think, maybe before I answer your question, I think it's important just to appreciate the proper context that was painted by both Anton and Nomshado, which has laid a very good foundation for our discussion this morning. But also to add that the IEC and NMA and the South African National Interest Forum, in the run-up to the election, we ran quite an extensive program that we called Media Elections. A training program really that we took to all provinces and to individual newsrooms, big newsrooms like the SABC, which is the biggest newsroom in the country, etc., etc. And we covered in the main the Electoral Amendment Act, which was to help journalists understand what the new act means, the new electoral landscape, the three ballots, and we dealt quite a lot with the important areas that Nomshado covered, and that was supported by quite a comprehensive program that was ran by the Civic and Democracy Unit of the IEC. And they covered and used not only mainstream media, but quite a lot of community-based media. And if you listen to a little bit of what Anton was saying, you can see that evidence before us is showing us that mainstream media, as we know it, that definition is quickly changing. And my own sense is that community media is becoming mainstream media and needs to be supported and used and recognized as such. But I also wanted to say that, we are at a very important stage in our country, 30 years of democracy. So maybe it's a time for us to ask ourselves a number of hard questions. The Constitution is our most important document. It gives all of us rights. So the Constitution gives the IEC the right to organize and manage elections. But with each right comes a responsibility. So the IEC has got a responsibility to deliver elections that are both free, fair, and credible. Right? If you look at the ordinary citizen, the voter, look at the issue that Nomshado was talking about, that we spoke about for the last 6 months before the elections, and misinformation and malinformation. Individuals have got their right to freedom of expression guaranteed in the Constitution. So the question is, what responsibility does citizens have, in exercising this right? We've spoken quite a lot this morning also about what responsibility does the platforms have. I have the right to say what I want to say, but in exercising that right, it must be clear that I cannot violate the right of the next person. And that we've seen quite a lot in the run-up and during the elections, where some of the electoral commissioners and staff are subjected to all of these things, threats, misinformation and misinformation. So my own sense is that, you know, now that the elections are done and dusted, I think we must have that hard discussion. You know, what responsibility do the people who are chasing the followers and clicks, what responsibility do they have for the content that we publish? You know, and this starting relationship that Namshado referred to between the IEC and the social media platforms is fantastic. But I think it's time to take it to a much higher level, you know, because we are always trying to close the door after the horses has bolted. You know, that we need to find a solution. You know, I agree with Anton that regulation is not the way to go. Self-regulation is the way to go. But how do we make sure that the platforms get to that? Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Then just to go into the very interesting statistic, Namshada, that you had up there about the gendered voice that is within the media space, firstly, and how on the back end of it is the bullying of women journalists more specifically. I find that very interesting, and I found it even more interesting that there's layered intersections of the types of lives that these women specifically live. And I'm sure you do want to go into the sensitivities on different ways that they are attacked, and I'm sure they're pretty intense. Since we're talking about asking the hard questions, within this 30-year democracy, you would think that there should be a balanced gendered perspective when it comes to how media is perceived, how media is consumed. Why do you think, and I think I know why, but I want us to get into it, but why do you think that information is more digestible, I guess, as the data shows, when it comes from men than when it comes from women? What role do you think patriarchy and views of patriarchy have played in how people want to receive information? Not necessarily how they receive it, but how they want it to have their own confirmation biases, so to speak.
I mean, I think you mentioned the two key things there. We live in a society where it's deeply embedded rather in patriarchy. When we present these findings, and our main aim is to have the findings but also engage media as well to find out what are the issues, why is it that we're still seeing the same percentages over the years, no matter which societal issue we even speak about. Even GBV itself, it would be a slight difference, although it looks completely different from elections. And the key things would be, number one, access to these women. They don't have that access. They would approach political parties, and when they would give representatives, they would give the male leaders, and the female leaders would be at the back end. Or in some cases, it would be very rare that it happens. When it comes to a more societal setting, they would go to communities and they would try to seek out female voices, and they would shrink themselves back and rather put in the male leaders to the front, because they also fear as to what they would say and how it would impact, how it's actually received by the public. And I think this is where the biggest things, initiatives we've been seeing around empowering women to come into that space has been key. But second to that is to be very honest with that, dismantling that needs to happen when it comes to accessing those voices, because the reality is the very same spaces that women did not have access to historically, they have access to now. They are operating in those spaces, they're leading in those spaces, they are solution builders in those spaces, thought leaders as well in those spaces. But how do we ensure that our society is engaging holistically and seeing the representation of those different sectors there? And I think this is where a lot of, number one, dismantling, but second to that, working with media and seeing also how do we create a hub where these women can be accessed, right?
Then just one last question from me before we open it up to the audience on the floor. Has to do with this very big challenge of echo chambers and algorithms that I think we couldn't really get into very much so, I think much of in your presentation, but I think it's part of the tough challenges that we have to deal with in any period in democracy, whether it's elections, post-election period, pre-election period. Because a study was done just not so long ago where someone created a TikTok page for themselves, and he specifically, even though he's a black person, specifically made himself a white man and created the account as a white man, and liked only one video. And the video was a workout gym video. And within 15 videos of him being in that account and not necessarily engaging with anything else, he was already in the alt-right pipeline that was speaking about the ideas of what is the role of the woman, what's not the role of the woman, all the way down to then Trump ideology, to then deeper than that about, I guess, the child pornography world, just in like that. And that happens because of algorithms and how they are catered towards what the algorithm believes your experience is as a person. And we saw that with these elections. And one thing that I really did appreciate is that every single time we went onto TikTok, for example, during this period, any election video that popped up, immediately at the bottom it said, for more information, please visit the IUC page. And that was a good fact checker moment. But I kept thinking to myself, what if I just completely ignored that? And I continue to engage with information that, to me, looks credible, to me is entertaining, but is in fact so dangerous to democratic principles. And I just want to ask you two, how do you think we're going to navigate that space where an algorithm does not want you to engage with alternative content and only wants to engage you with what it thinks you should hear? Someone creating an echo chamber within an echo chamber, which is very dangerous for democracy.
I can go first on that one. The reality around algorithms is each platform has their own recipe of them. They're not gonna give that up because it's their money maker. It's what keeps people coming back to their platforms, but also keeps people to stay longer onto their platforms. Although over the years we started seeing, the intervention of, would you like to engage more with this content? Yes or no? Do you like the suggestion? You don't want to see more of these suggestions? Because they started realizing that people felt discomfort with some of the content that they were pushing back to them. But in a context of election, a period such an election, it's very different. As you said, some people might not read that bottom fine print that says, go to the IEC for more information, because what I'm seeing is it's a huge influx of the same narratives from different profiles, from different perspectives. And in that case, I'm already building a picture on my own. But the funny part is the content that you started with is not the content that you're going to end with. And that's how the algorithms also work. They have a certain way of building a momentum to get you to interact with content that originally didn't actually even envision you would, or you were not on the platform to engage with. Now, in an election context, that's very different, because I might have went on to understand, okay, they're saying there's rigging in this area. What are other people saying, right? And then it keeps pushing back on the same types of narratives. But at the back end of that as well, there's also what you call bots and botnets. And not everyone understands that behind a profile it can actually be a person or no person at all. It can be just an operated platform. And because now we've got AI that creates perfectly fine-tuned, sophisticated profiles that you would assume this is Nomshata looking like this, only to find out was a generated AI image. And then one of the things we're also flagging, sorry, since we're talking about algorithms and I now might be going a bit left here, was we always assume, for example, with generative media, such as images and deepfakes and so forth, that you've got the image to work with, right? But what about generative audio? It's just somebody's voice. How do you detect from that? And a platform such as WhatsApp, where there's no algorithm, it's just forwarding. You just see a voice note that says forwarded many times. And because I received it and it was forwarded many times, clearly people are interacting with it and it might be true. So I think that's where, as Jovial mentioned, we need to take the level a bit higher when it comes to the engagement but also find the realities of that each platform's algorithms are operating to ensure that they obviously find relevance within the larger ecosystem of other platforms as well.
Jeffrey, you want to add before I open to the floor?
Just briefly, I think, I can't say it better than she has, but I can just emphasize that I think where we headed to here is that Anton touched it on a little bit. If you are an editor of a publication, digital, print, whatever, you take responsibility for all the content, that goes into your publication. So social media platforms need to be held accountable for that and everything else. There needs to be a mechanism where they can be held to account to the public. For instance, why is it that they find it okay to allow for anonymous posts or for people to hide behind names that are not their own and then abuse that? So there are two issues there. One is the identity that is not true, and the second is information that is not true.
I feel attacked right now because I actually have a ghost account that I don't post on at all, so don't worry. I'm going to open up to the audience. I'll take about 3 questions, and if we can keep them super duper brief, I would appreciate it. May I recognize you? Brian, over here first, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then your second, if you can take all 3 before people, they get moved by the spirit.
Yes.
And they start speaking.
Recognize you. You also had your hand up. Okay, so only the people in the front that want to talk today.
Okay.
And that's fine.
Cool. Can I quickly just take liberties? For Jovial, do you think your internal process at the IEC helps or hinders the curbing of mis and disinformation, specifically around elections? Last week, people are sort of raving online about the updating of numbers on the IEC database, but it seems to have taken you guys close to a day or 2 to correct the mathematical calculation and all of that. So the more things linger out there without sort of you correcting it as an institution, it harms the narrative around the election. So do you think the internal bureaucratic processes helps or hinders your process in terms of curbing that disinformation? For the MMA, you guys do take down of content specifically, but if you find a trend of a specific account being judged for the same issues, do you drive for takedown of that account as well, or at least further investigation by that platform? And ultimately, I've seen, you know them, the Gulams of the world, the Rajvansis, they are driving specific narratives, and to what extent, where some of them have been proven to be erroneous. What's the collaboration and work that happens around specific accounts? Thank you very much. Thank you. No, close on, please. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Question kune-issue yaka-IEC mina angazi noma yimina ngedwa yini kunezinto engibone ngazuthi u-IEC akazange azifake ngendlela kwi-media izinto eziwu-2 nje ngibonile eyokuqala ile section 24 mhlawumbe mangachaza nje ukuthi umuntu akakwazi ukuvota esiteshini angazange aze arejiste kusona kulama elections lawo. Esibili kube i-voter education, ngicabanga ukuthi kube noleka kulezo zinto khona okunye futhi nale yama-ballot awu-3 ngicabanga lezo zinto ikakhulukazi nje kodwa le yokuthi umuntu akakwazi ukuvota esiteshini engesona sakhe kwaba ne-confusion enkulu and abantu abaningi abakwazi ukuvota ngoba ayizange ikhulumeke izwakale kahle kwi-media. Okwesibili ngiyaqolisa kahle uNomshado, ngicela ukubuza la ka-MMA, umuntu uyakwazi ukuriphotha kumina if noma nibhekelela ama-journalist kuphela noma even i-public mhlambe ukhulumeke kabi ngami kube ne-malinformation or spread ama-news ngami, can I report that kwi-organization yenu noma nje just there uthatha ama-stats and stuff. Yeah.
I promise Brian I'll try to be as brief as possible. I didn't introduce myself earlier. My name is Tobanis. I have three things to say. Maybe the panel may reflect on that. One, why do we continue to speak of the media as some neutral ideological tool that is just neutral, that can't be influenced, that doesn't carry a particular type of thought about how it sees things and how it wants to express things? Why do we continue to do that? Because I think when we do that, we're almost also just saying that the media almost just reflects what is real without having a particular lens on how it sees that thing and how it sees phenomena in events and happens. Right? Two, on the issue of the IEC, I mean, I have a lot to say, but maybe some of it is not good for public consumption. But I have a lot to say in the IEC. But one of the problems I have, maybe it goes with what Brian was asking. There is some part where I think the IEC did not take charge of its own narrative. That, for example, the IEC suddenly, on the 29th to the 1st, has on the ballots one single numbers. So, for example, it counted the votes as they were casted by individuals. So the ANC was sitting at about 6,000 votes, and the ADA about 3,000, and. Then there's the big hoo-ha about elections rigging and all those things. What does the IEC do? Suddenly just wakes up and changes the dashboard to N+R and doesn't explain to anyone. Right? When the public then goes and you see, we were right when we were saying we were rigging elections. Suddenly the ANC comes and says, no, but first of all, why was there a need for the N+R situation? I don't think it was needed. First of all, the people casted votes as individuals. Our votes don't count 3 times, they count once. So the idea of going up there and saying N+R and being 20,000, it also just confuses ourselves, confuses us. Because the dashboard allows for me to be able to see how much does KwaZulu-Natal contribute in the regional votes. So why go confuse me in the main screen? And then don't take charge of the narrative after that. And then because you open yourself up to scrutiny, which is not necessary. The third thing, maybe the last thing is, I mean maybe it ties to what I was saying in the beginning. The media does 2 things, maybe, in my understanding. It sets the agenda of the nation. It builds a particular narrative. Many other things that it does, but those 2 things for me are amongst the key things. So if we continue to see the media as not having a role that is playing, the last thing is that also journalists must take a responsibility. We speak about protection of journalists, and of course, as a professional myself, I want to be protected when I'm doing my job. But also, journalists in recent years have entered the political arena and now want to play as if they are being neutral when they clearly can be seen of their bias. So if you are now going to do that, you are going to be taken on, and you must be ready for that because you have made yourself available to that. The other thing is that journalists have started to do what we call tabloid journalism. You follow the headline, you don't follow the news, you don't follow the events. This is why in your interview processes in the media, you only want to ask about what? About the headline. No one wants to go deeper and do investigative journalism. Everyone wants the numbers, because the numbers do what? Pay. So when we criticize, when we say, and of course we are going to be accused of generalizing, but look at all media platforms, look at the podcast channels, all of them are chasing numbers. This is why they do clickbait journalism. No one wants to do real work. And when we say you are bad, we're going to be accused of saying, no, we're painting you with the same brush. But unfortunately, the media does these things in front of us. We work with them, we understand them, but unfortunately we have no other duty of making sure that they are criticized. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you very much. I think it's also a question around government spokespersons. Certain government spokespersons who represent certain ministries, campaign time they don certain shirts, but they weren't able to differentiate when you're using the same account that they tweet government information on to now tweet about a political party that they represent, and that was a bit problematic in terms of that. Yeah.
Thank you guys. I'm having a little bit of deja vu seeing Mshado and Jovial in this panel from an IEC event similar to this on this, and I think it's good for public education, etc., etc. So it's necessary. I do agree with my colleague over here in the main. However, with the relationship with the IEC and the media, those two are key to key tenets of our democracy and our pillars that need to be maintained. The independence, however, and those things might be questioned, but we are a friend of the IEC, and I think every public citizen should be, in a way that does have a mammoth task. It goes beyond the mandate of the IEC, goes beyond just the running of an election and putting numbers out there, but also speaks to public education and civic education, and that goes on throughout the years. I mean, we have an election almost every 2 years in this country, whether it's by-elections, so there's a machinery that operates there that I think people also seem not to remember, and we just think it should happen. When it comes to media relations in particular, I think there's room for improvement. When it comes to media monitoring Africa and all the tools that you create, it's too much, in my opinion. I've just had a look at your site now, and I'm looking forward to the Dexter report. That would be very interesting. But that is also a very simple way of just utilizing AI and what is available. Someone, programmed that, and we called it Dexter, and now it's out there. And who makes use of these tools, and whether or not they're actually in communities. And like with Brian to say earlier, that when we have news reports covering that, it does not focus, it's very urbanized. And I think there was a lack of that in this discussion. I didn't get any of that from the discussion you had at all. And so there's that need, and that's where the gap has been created for young startups and entrepreneurs who, like the Happy Valley Radios, for instance, who are having these conversations about real community issues, because I know that my neighbor has just been sexually assaulted, and that's something that needs to be done about that, and what is the community response to that, and how has the Metro Police responded, etc. That doesn't make it to the SABC prime time news, whether it's on Chivenda, whether it's on 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 6:30, etc. There is that urban bias, and that also pushes people back to social media, because it's so easy for me to go onto the Opera Mini, and I'm getting all these news things that are problematic. However, what is concerning is the fact that are we limiting people's right to information, firstly, through paywalls? That is the biggest problem I find, and I see it to be, because now accessing real information and real news by credible journalists, I'm not saying anybody's not credible in this room, we're learning. And if you're going through these things, there needs to be a set, and I'm going to just hammer on that there needs to be a set standard of what constitutes media, what is a journalist, and the ethics and goals, because nobody can just be walking around with a camera and call themselves a journalist. Or a video journalist is a profession, and you are removing, we need to speak broadly about that as well, is what is media, and what constitutes media and a media house. I cannot be a freelancer here and say I represent Media 24, NASPAR, Caxton Group, or whoever, or Arena Holdings. That's a media house, and that has a specific agenda, that has their own management and has their board. But there's one thing, there's a thread, and that's running through is having to subscribe and being accountable to the press ombudsman. So that's the issue here. For that, I think I'm hopping on to it too long, but I want us to look into that a little bit more, because young startups are great, etc., but the only way to counter this disinformation is by trying to democratize these paywalls, firstly, like the Daily Mavericks do, for instance. Fantastic news thing, but I'm the thesaurus, and a dictionary to understand that all the time. But, I mean, it's good for us because it challenges us and we should be reading it because it's free. How now? I can't access Business Day, I can't access your financial mails, I can't access the stories because, oopsie, you don't have 75 Rand a month to read my stories. I suppose so, but now the newspaper, I could get the newspaper second-hand from somebody, a day or two later perhaps. We need to also focus on that. And so now, we trust a Caxton publication that is a local publication that employs local South Africans, that write local stories, then go onto my Facebook and look for my local group. Because I find that there would be way too much distraction there, whereas I could go in and pick up a Berlin Mail, for instance, in Glenwood, and I'm able to then look at what is the community doing.
Thank you very much. Journalism, like democracy, is expensive. Someone needs to pay for it.
Yeah, and I think the way you guys are going to pay for it is magically answering all those questions in 5 minutes. So get to it.
I think the two things. One is that after each election, there's a major review process that takes place in the IEC. It is called the debrief session. So the IEC president staff, everybody is sitting somewhere in the Drakensberg now, doing a review, looking at what went wrong, what went right, frank discussions, So I think that one of the things that I undertake to do is to take some of the feedback that I get back to the debrief sessions. But I can tell you now that some of the issues that have been raised here around the speed, around owning the narrative, these are things that have been discussed already. Speed kills, a lot of people rush to social media because you want to be the first. Everybody's a journalist, breaking news, But if you haven't done basic journalism on that piece of information, you always end up with an egg on your face because the facts are not correct and so on, So this is a fight that is being had within the IEC. There's a very involved process of approval for every response that the IEC issues. And that tends to delay things. But the responses do come, and I think the speed has improved. Can it be better? Yes, it can be. In my view, I would like a response in half a minute. But the process there is that there are certain processes that must be, steps that must be followed before sign-off is achieved. And I think for an organization as big as the IEC, it's understandable. In the mid-year elections training sessions that we held, and in the thousands and thousands of messages that the CDE put out, Section 24A was quite a big focus, Mamian. So was the issue of the 3 ballots. Towards the end of April, we did a special results-only training session to take people through this very transparent results process of the IEC, to show them that not only is the IEC probably the most transparent electoral management body of the African continent, but that it's visually impossible to rig elections, But can we do more? Could we have spent a little bit more money, more time to explain these things? Of course, yes. But what I want to deal with is that the view that maybe nothing was done. A lot was done, but we can always do more. I think the issue that Tobani was raising around the media setting the agenda and stuff like that, I'm tempted to answer that, but I think maybe Anthony is better placed to
Yeah, also maybe it can be answered while everyone's having some coffee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Nomshad, over to you.
Okay, I'm assuming it's not 5 minutes anymore, it's a
2
minute
seconds.
when you said coffee. Okay, on the mark there. I think quickly one takedown, yes, there's been pages detected, also accounts detected pushing certain narratives, and that's their main agenda. They were flagged, and usually there are, outside from takedown notice, it's also further investigation for the whole page. Some have been completely blocked after investigation, and then obviously some are still pending. But also happy to check more about that. Second to that, Mama, yes, you can actually also submit. We've had a few cases actually of citizens who were harassed by those in power based on certain things that they were asking and saying. So the platform is open for that. The media question is a big one. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I've got 5 seconds on it. But I want to just build a scenario. If we had to say, right, and what you said is valid, because now we're dealing with what hat am I wearing when I'm saying this narrative or when I'm saying this view. And particularly on social media, that line can be blurred. But we cannot run away from the important role that media plays. And we also cannot run away from the important role that traditional media plays. And this is where our national broadcaster actually comes into play if we're going to start talking about the different ways that news intercepts in our homes. Because this is where you've got news coming in all languages, news coming in different forms. And even though they went digital in a free way. So it clearly stipulates and shows that as a broadcaster, from a continental perspective, we're actually one of the broadcasters that's looked upon in terms of the way we operate. But if I had to pose a question 5 years from now, building on that neutral narrative that you're speaking, and looking at the digital landscape, looking at the role of AI and what AI has been doing, looking at the new forms of news, right? And looking at how it's been going in terms of sustainability. 5 years from now, our next election, if we have perhaps lost even more than half of the media houses that we had, if SABC was not operating functionally, if we're just stuck on a digital platform, how would news dissemination look like at that point? That's quite scary for me, thinking about that. So every time I hear a question around the role of media, I go back to such scenarios because the reality is, if we are not, number one, we're not saying media is perfect. I think even Anton mentioned that media is not perfect. We do know that there's gaps and there's room of improvement. But second to that, we cannot run away from the importance of protecting that function of our democracy, because it's a need.
Great. I actually also wanted to make a comment about the tabloids, and perhaps how that reflects where we are as a society today. That it might not necessarily be something that is fully on the responsibility of the tabloid journalists, but also how media functions in a supply and demand context. Those tabloids don't exist without people buying them and being entertained by them. And that has a massive reflection on where we are as a society in terms of how we view relationships with influencers, with celebrities, over worrying about democratic freedoms, right? And I think a part of it has to do with the fact that news can sometimes be so depressing that gossiping is so much fun and it is such a relief. And media has identified that that is a place to make profit. People would like to gossip because it's a human thing to do. So let's provide that. So there's a lot of intricacies that are happening, and I want to end that there because as a young person, I've got a very low attention span because of social media. And program director, I assume we're going to a break now?
Yes, I'm just going to make a quick announcement.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much to Yanga. Round of applause for thank you very much. The GCIS is here, and they'll be giving a presentation after tea as part of the program. But perhaps what I want to just, in the upcoming conversation, can we consider and think about things like Section 24A, the changes in legislation, that they weren't the primary and singular responsibility of the IEC. Ask ourselves on various levels, other government institutions who are meant to be disseminating information. When legislation changes, it's meant to be a public participation process as well. To what extent did we as citizens participate in the changes of that legislation? How come we weren't aware when a law so significant to our existence wasn't done? Where were political parties in the space of educating their own constituencies? The surprise and shock of new political parties about the signature requirement at the time in which those things were meant to be done. Is it just to drive the narrative that the IEC is problematic? Where were they in that process? And so we need to ask more accountability, not only of the IEC, but also of these other stakeholders in the electoral cycle. Tea break for 15 minutes. Let's be back and seated at 22:12, and then we'll continue on. Can I ask our speakers to please join us quickly for a group photo at the front? Coffee and tea is that side. Remember, we have lunch later.